It seems that the sacraments of the Christian faith have come to be rather badly neglected. And we want to talk a little about that this morning. First of all, the ceremony of marriage is probably one of the basic rituals of the entire world. There's no religion that does not have it. And my own experience with it, as working with persons desiring to marry, is now extended over a long time. I performed my first marriage ceremony in the fall of 1923 and have continuously performed marriages ever since that time. We are not a large marriage group, but we do try to work with people who are a little disillusioned and seriously hurt by the gradual deterioration of the religious element in matrimony. Actually, people have come to me time and time again and said that, frankly, they did not want a judicial marriage. They did not want to be married by a judge nor by a justice of the peace. They wanted a marriage that inspired some form of internal commitment to mutual assistance and regard over the period of a lifetime. What seems to be happening today is that those deciding to live together are trying in every way possible to avoid commitment. They avoid the responsibilities of settling down to a serious matter of living together. Now, it isn't the ceremony alone, but it is the living together that constitutes the sacredness of the marriage ceremony. And in this day, we see more and more the values of responsibility being disintegrated or left behind in a mad dash for what we call now the fun generation. Today, as everyone seems to be interested primarily in fun, and fun is mostly excess of some kind of another, and it does not contain very much to inspire the person to better living or better thinking. Now, how does the fun generation get into this picture? I think it happens when we go back to the day when the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb has destroyed the continuity of human purpose. It has committed a terrible crime against the survival of the human family. It is not simply the explosion of bombs that are the major consideration. It is a life lived under constant danger of annihilation. This annihilation may never come, but every day it hangs over the world, disintegrating and destroying the integrities of human life. We have much to praise in science, but it has also handed us this terrible disaster. The disaster of knowledge being abused and perverted to the ultimate degree, beyond which there can be nothing but chaos. So with the loss of securities, the end of a period in which people could plan lives, could work together with certain vision of purpose, with all this gradually undermined, we also have had a serious financial situation, namely the problem of competitive nuclear armament. The whole world is spending most of the money that it needs to feed the hungry, to produce weapons for mutual destruction. Why do neighbors have to live together or side by side for 500 years and then go into a frantic nuclear armament competition which destroys every other stability of these countries? There seems to be no reasonable answer to the problem. It is the result of a gradual shift of the human mind away from the basic reasons for living and setting that mind hard in the problem of immediate enjoyment and dissipation. These things are of great and serious moment to thoughtful persons. We go to the Chinese for a moment because in the old days they were rather thoughtful people. And we find a very simple fact, namely that the family was the psychobiological cell in the great human race. Every family is a unit of life. Every family is part of a structure, as blood cells are part of the human body. Each family has its part to play, not only in the perpetuation of humanity, but in the social conditions of generation after generation of human beings. This very important factor has now been completely ignored. The problem of reproduction outside of marriage is one which again offers a very serious problem of ethics. It dissolves the responsibility factor and removes from human activity the blessing of a divine principle. Gradually, after 50 years or more of extreme materialism, we are coming back to a religious way of life. Religion is increasing all over the world because we simply cannot endure without it. A life lived without spiritual overtones or the consolation of spiritual convictions is almost useless. We are here to learn something, and when we set ourselves firmly against learning and decide to live only for the moment to do what we please, then the entire reason for this great cycle of embodiments is lost. We are not able to continue to live the life that is necessary for the perpetuation of universal purposes. So we have to consider very definitely the problems of keeping something resembling human ethics alive in this world. Ethics is something, however, that has a deadly enemy, and that deadly enemy is wealth. For some unknown reason, nearly all human beings are victims of the temptations of greed and ambition. Up to very recently, however, these factors did not touch everyone. There was a good, solid body of humanity that lived decently, lived well, lived constructively, and did the work of the world. This body of dedicated people, of honest, sincere workmen in various fields of activity, these good homemakers, and the various integrities which they communicated, all these levels are gradually disappearing. And we are finding now that there is only one real answer to the human question: why are we here? And the answer is to have fun. Or if we wish to enlarge this answer a little, we can say to be rich. And if we want to go just a little bit further than that, we can also say to live without consideration of moral consequence. These values, or lack of values, or false values, are very dominant in our society today. Now it would be nice indeed if we could hope to get together a new way of life. It is coming. The ailment is bringing its own remedy. The remedy may be sharp, but it is coming. And gradually out of this morass we shall come to something better. In the meantime, however, as we wait and labor with all the understanding and insight that we possess, there are certain things we can do. We can start this reformation inside of ourselves. We can decide that regardless of what other people do, we will do as far as possible that which is nearly as right as we can perform the act. We will do everything we can to keep the rules. And if we do this in some mysterious way, if enough people begin keeping the rules will be restored in their full dignity. We cannot hope that some legislative body is going to correct all these problems, for the legislators are suffering from the same elements and ailments that the followers are suffering. Therefore, we have to consider it essential to do these things for ourselves. We have to make these decisions, and we have to try to live them, and live them as nicely and as pleasantly and as constructively as possible. The Chinese were very strong in their realization of the tremendous importance of family. And most nations throughout the world have had very strong family codes. These codes were for the protection of the young, so that the new generation coming in and coming up would be endowed with the best values and integrities of the past. It was assumed that the parental responsibility was to produce offspring who would be decent people, honorable people, and contribute to the general advancement of society. The responsibility of family is now being seriously shaken. The responsibility of the adult to produce a new generation of young people is fading away. Each individual is for himself. Each individual is desirous of advancing his own career. If there is any advantage to the person, the family is neglected. Now, of course, there are always some good families, and there always will be. And for these we have our heartiest support and good thoughts. But too many people are now recognizing only one motive for existence, their own personal pleasure. They want to do what they want to do, regardless of consequences. And as a result of that, civilization, as a group of people dwelling together in peace, is fading away. There is no longer any grave concern for cooperation. And the people come to me now very frequently with problems which were practically unknown 25 years ago. Individuals who want to know how they can go on in profession, advance financially, take job after job, become executives without one single thought of family or actually of friendship. All of these modifying, quieting emotions have disappeared. We also find all over the world that the tremendous armament matter is working a terrible detriment upon family life. The money and funds that are necessary to feed children are being spent on military equipment. Everywhere we turn, we are being exploited by our own and by everyone else. And in this problem, the thoughtful person has to fall back upon something that will sustain him in these emergencies. And I think the type of thing that we have been doing here for all these years is an example of the type of problem by which we can advance some of the good causes that concern us most. We know that people are happier, more secure, more reasonable, and more purposeful if they have something within themselves that is guiding them, a principle of integrity within themselves. As the individuals increase in number who have integrity, world integrity rises. Because after all, each of the individuals in a unit pattern is an important factor and can result in an improvement of the entire unit. This is very important in our thinking at the present time. So we want to emphasize the very great importance of preserving the nice things of life, the gentle things, the kindly things, the unselfish and thoughtful things, and not accept competition as an excuse for the disintegration of personal integrity. It's all so foolish, and yet we are so slow to understand. Actually, all of this tremendous struggle that we are going through, day by day, has no meaning. It has no end. It has nothing at the termination except the same end that has come to every living thing since the dawn of time. Actually, all of this competition reminds us that the path of glory leads but to the grave. All of these mistakes we are making are sacrificing value for something that has no value, and compromising friendship for a little success, and then the same silence, friend and enemy lying side by side. There seems to be no justification of trying to build a physical empire in a temporary environment such as the earth. There is no reason to hope that the individual can fulfill all his ambitions and be happy, and in the end survive to enjoy them and gloat over them as time goes on. We all simply do our little bit and then go, and the place is taken by someone else. And very often we are the ones that train that someone else, and the issues get more and more painful and unfortunate. So let us try to think of the idea of religion. The Bible tells us that marriage is a sacrament acceptable to God, that deity in its life and plan and purpose has willed and intended that man shall not live alone, that we shall have families, that we shall have the joy and the spiritual experience of growing together. Perhaps we might best say that the family represents a kind of test, a ritual, an admission into the mysteries of social integrity. The family is a challenge. It is also a way of growth. The people who make up good families are stronger people, better people, and the society in which they live is benefited by their honesty. Actually, the family is a kind of sacred mystery system. It is an initiation into human maturity. The individual who lives alone by choice, as sometimes in monastic orders, may have certain qualifications and justifications for his action. But for the running of human beings, the family is the test of integrity. It is the test of loyalty, of honor, of honesty, and of all of the cooperations of friendship and affection. It is a test of human beings willing to sacrifice something of their freedom to protect the life of which they are a part. By giving something of our own freedom, we preserve the freedom of the world, which otherwise is lost. So I'd like to think of marriage perhaps as a kind of testing, a kind of first degree in the mysteries of growth. The individual coming into the world comes into a family. Today, most young people looking back over the family life may not find it particularly advantageous. They may regard themselves as considerably underprivileged, that they have not received the proper instruction, guidance, and attention the children are entitled to. But even if this be true, the young person who feels thus neglected has something more important to do than pass on neglect to the next generation. It is up to him to do things that will make this better and more secure for all concerned. A family is therefore like the famous 47th proposition of Pythagoras, a triangulation of energies. It is a group forming a unit. It is a cosmos, a solar system. It is a magnificent geometric pattern in miniature. It is like some glorious flower, each of the petals of which is necessary to the beauty of the entire. And furthermore, like the flower, this marriage is a seed factor. It is something by means of which the race is perpetuated, and in each generation there is a natural growth and unfoldment of positive resources. So in the idea of a family, we have all kinds of complications. Many families have comparatively easy times, but many are in very desperate straits much of the time. And as these desperate straits close in, the tendency is naturally to break up the patterns and to run away from the responsibilities. This factor is also added to now by another factor, namely not to establish a family at all. The family becomes a danger and a hazard to independence. But what is independence? Independence for the individual is simply doing what he pleases or doing what he thinks he can do, and regardless of other people. This is not really independence. No individual who is not self-sustaining and an honorable member of society is really free and independent. Many people are simply in bondage and slavery to their own desires, appetites, and ambitions. They are failing utterly in the fulfillment of the purpose for which they were intended. Now, if the family can be preserved in some form of intelligent pattern, we have from the family the seed of larger organizations. Communities are groups of families. Nations are larger groups of families. The world is one vast family. And the laws that govern the individual household are the same laws that govern the human equation in the universe, regarding the life and purpose of collective forms of generation. Actually, therefore, the family problem is more than merely a protection or a habit or something that's just being done or something like that. The family is the beginning of a mature civilization. Where the family fails, the society falls apart. Where society falls apart, there is only ruin. And this ruin is not something you can pass on indefinitely. Ruin is becoming more and more dangerous. It is out of ruin that contagious ailments rise, that animosities are nursed and perpetuated, and anarchy flourishes, and revolution after revolution comes to release the individual, not from his faults, but from other people's faults. He still has his own. So with these types of thoughts in our minds, we thought on this occasion of Easter that it would be advisable and useful to try to see something about getting the universal purpose of things back into the life of the individual. We know definitely in our own hearts the importance of honest affection. We know that love is a tremendous force in life. But so often now love is very largely a victim of ulterior motives. Love is being sacrificed, as other virtues are, to the success of personal ambitions, wealth, and the like. Therefore, the redemption of the principle of love is actually essential to the resurrection of human society. As Paul tells us, and so are these three: hope, faith, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Therefore, a sincere affection is probably the open door to the redemption of human character. That which we sincerely admire, that which we sincerely love, we cherish and desire to serve and to help. Where there is real affection, there is cooperation. Where there is deep affection, there is self-sacrifice. And where there is a strong, abiding friendship between generations and families, there is a strong defense of principles and a determination to maintain the proper values of life. For a long time, we were suffering considerably from what was commonly called atheism. Atheism was a sort of rejection of a deity that did not seem to be very honorable. It seemed like it never occurred to people that atheism was really a punishment for their own way of trying to live in a universe, the rules of which they would not and could not obey. But anyway, atheism became very fashionable, and it took on strong scientific coloring, until finally the whole part of Western civilization was infiltrated by this unbelieving, this idea that there was nothing but this life and nothing after, and that therefore all we could do was have a grand time now. Well, that sounded pretty good to a lot of young people growing up especially, but look what has happened to the grand time. The grand time is now tremendous chaos. The grand time is just compounded misery. The grand time is crime, drugs, contagious diseases, plagues, bankruptcies, invasions, and assassination plots. The grand time is failing because nothing can be grand unless basically it is right. And the pattern that is now being cultivated is not right. More and more, however, we are waking up to this. And here and there and everywhere, there is a strong revival of belief in religious principles. It is becoming impossible, even in the atheistic state, so-called, to prevent the increase and dissemination of religious principles. We are now on the verge of a new era of religion. As it sits at the moment, this new era is more or less dominated by anxiety. It is desperation seeking an answer to its own problems. But actually, we are beginning to realize that down inside of ourselves we were never atheists and never could be. The atheism was a sophistication more or less justified by science and inspired by our educational theory. But actually it was not livable. And all over the world, where churches and temples were closed down, they are being opened again. Because, as Napoleon pointed out on one occasion, it's easy enough to conquer a people, but you cannot rule them after they are conquered without the help of religion. So that little by little, religion becomes an inspiring factor. There must be something happen to inspire people. They must find new motives for being bigger than they are. And of course the motives up to now have been largely patterned in the form of privations. The individual mustn't do this and he mustn't do that, and the thou shalt nots have dominated. But no matter how many of these thou shalt nots we have, things are still going badly because we're paying no attention to them. We are not really making the effort that we must make to cure the present problem. So go back to the family, which to me can be likened to the Eleusinian mysteries, or the early Christian mysteries, or the mysteries of Neoplatonism, of Buddhism, of Hinduism. All of these institutions were institutions of testing. No one was permitted to enter into the sacred sanctuaries of Egypt until they had passed through a period of probation. When Plato went to Egypt in search of the wisdom of the Egyptian temples, they made him go through a long and arduous probationship before they would accept him into their sanctuary. It was necessary, therefore, to wait and work and prove oneself before the advantages of higher learning could be bestowed. As a result of that, there were no learned atheists. The very process of initiation made atheism impossible. So that the ancient, when he produced a philosopher, produced also at the same time an idealist. So all these different steps come back into the home. The old temple buildings are mostly ruined. A lot of them are simply now for tourists to look at. But the ancient principles are still with us because they are part of the psychobiological life of the human being. So we have now the possibility of religiously interpreting things that we previously regarded as purely physical or industrial or economic. Actually, the family is a living entity. It is one made of several, but they have become one through mutual service, mutual understanding, and mutual acceptance of responsibility. They have really come to fulfill the obligations of the marriage ceremony as we find it in the Church of England, namely to serve one another, to be with each other, to go through both good and ill with each other, so long as life lasts. Nearly all marriages are declarations of life intent, but most of them today only last a few years. In other words, the oath taken is broken by the ones who took it. This is not good. Now some have tried to get away from this problem by simply not getting married, or by doing it completely from a legal or physical standpoint. But here again we have another very serious situation. The condition of the younger generation growing up in a society of the unmarried is very difficult, very dangerous, very sad, and is contributing to every demoralization that is affecting us today. We are in our present troubles because we have lost touch with the integrities of life, and we cannot do this without serious detriment. The young are here to learn how to live. Those of middle life are here to share living with each other over a long period of years, and the aged are those to look back upon wisdom and to prepare to incorporate the experiences of life into soul power. All these things are more or less taken for granted, in the ancient times at least, but now they are very difficult to find. Therefore, we might very definitely think, I believe, in taking the idea of marriage as it is, and trying to understand what it gives and what it costs. Now, marriage today is expensive. It is a cost because it requires the acceptance of mutual obligations. To maintain this union, or to maintain this social entity of marriage, therefore many families are broken up by most of the adults being employed and the children left at whatever devices they have. Now, we can't say that the individual who has to go out of the home in order to make a living is completely responsible for this situation. But he is part of a way of life that is gradually built in a fake superiority of non-ethics. The whole of society pays absolutely little or no attention to the problems of how to save society itself, how to prevent this entire structure from falling apart. We create competition. We exploit to the last degree. We inflate beyond comprehension. We make every possible effort to destroy the economic security of the majority of the people. And we expect this condition to end in wealth for some and a kind of psychological slavery for the rest. It's simply the fact that we have come this far and we have lost contact with the realities of life. One reason, perhaps, also where we're in some of our trouble is the fact that we are no longer a philosophical people. We no longer read philosophy, or if we do, it is contemporary and meaningless. We do not build upon the wisdom that has been given to us. We ignore the knowledge that is available to us because we are too busy watching television. We are too busy watching the perpetuation of a continuous deceitfulness which has no value to us or to anyone else. So if we are going to solve some of this problem, we have to take into very definite consideration the pressure that is being put on us from up above, the exploitation of the human being, an exploitation that is growing more and more intense and is being revealed in the corruptions in every phase of our life. In the last 10 years, we have had more corruptions exposed on the higher levels of legislation probably than in the previous 100 years. Everything is being sacrificed, and somewhere in the midst of this sacrifice is a human being who would like to be good and finds it almost impossible to express the virtues with which he is naturally endowed. Well, that is a very bad problem, and it's not going to be solved very easily. But in many, many ways, we can break the pattern and do things that we didn't know we could do. We could look over the family budget, for example, and find out how much of the income beyond the absolute necessities, how much of that income is being wasted on fun. Not the kind of fun that makes everybody happy, but the kind of fun that you have to get over in a hospital. The kind of fun that is a result of dissipation, of uselessness. Then we can take another little look at our financial situation and see what we are wasting on trivia. We are becoming utterly obsessed by the fact that we've got to buy something new every minute. The promotional side of our economy is wearing us out. We are being tempted every day to things we do not need, actually do not want, and perhaps do not know what to do with. But they're new, they're here, they're available, and the best people have them. And so we gradually indebt ourselves for these things. We are therefore actually not as poor as we might be if we didn't waste money. We might have a little more to do useful things with. If we're going to buy gadgets, why don't we buy gadgets that mean something? and not some kind of a contrivance that wears out in 1 year and has to be replaced? Why not invest part of this in personal growth, personal integrity, enlargement of understanding and insight? Instead of buying some contrivance, why don't we study or go and take courses on things that are valuable, or do one thing or another to assist in the underprivileged, instead of simply wasting a fortune on things that nobody really wants? The recent auctions of art in various parts of the world are scandalous, and they realize prices that are utterly and completely unreasonable. And the reason this is possible is that a few persons have become, in one way or another, extremely wealthy without doing any serious thinking on any subject. They are simply fortunate for something like sports, theater, or some time of speculation. So they go to an auction sale in Hong Kong, New York, or London, and buy a Chinese vase for $15,000, a small screen with a little inlay of ivory, $10,000, and a painting by some European artist who never was really very good for $3.5 million. Now, this is not only a thing that occasions, but every paper and every architectural and artistic journal is loaded with this type of information. People are buying things they don't know what to do with and don't want, simply because they can afford them. In order to really mature, as Plato may have found out in Egypt, the buying power must be disciplined by integrity. We do not buy things because they're for sale. We buy them because we have some justifiable reason for having them. And possession to be locked up, or bad taste to be perpetuated, these are not legitimate uses of our funds. We also realize that more and more we become involved in a tremendous world debt program, and gradually this has got to change. But many times, and too often, the average person goes with this, drifts along and feels that this tremendous national or international indebtedness is protecting him or thoroughly justified. It isn't. The only thing he can do, however, is to build a little empire within his family, or within his own little circle of persons who know, or perhaps within the little church he belongs to, as a nucleus, a center of integrity in a whirling, uncontrollable world. He has to put his roots down. He has to do something, because not only are we thinking now of trying to get through this life in one piece, but we are thinking of what we are here for in the larger sense. Maybe some of the things that we do would be excusable if we had no vision of security or advancement or purpose beyond the present. But we know for internal conviction and reasons that man is an eternal creature. We are essentially immortal, fumbling around in a mortal world. We are something that is without beginning or end, but we spend most of our time trying to kill ourselves. We have forgotten that we are citizens of an eternal world, that we are citizens of an immortal purpose, that we are here because of what we have been and what we have done, and we go from here to next places because of what we are here. The idea that we are simply individuals who have the prior right, if we so desire, to kill ourselves in any way we seem to please, including drugs or emphysema or whatever it may be. We are actually creatures the like of which the world has never known before. Actually, the human being is the most extraordinary creature that has ever been devised to our knowledge. There's undoubtedly more extraordinary ones further up, but we don't see them. But here we do see a magnificent potential going to seed. Not only going to seed, but rotting out, simply because of lack of integration, orientation, lack of purpose, lack of vision, and at the same time spending fortunes trying to be happy. We hardly can pick up a paper now without seeing the misery that this struggle causes. And I've noticed in the last couple of Easters that have come along, some things that are disturbing and some things that are encouraging. The encouraging things are that there are more and more people concerned with the significance of Easter. And the interest in this is now extending beyond Christendom. It is becoming important in many other religions, because it also combines the religion with one of the basic scientific principles of antiquity, and that is the vernal equinox, which was always regarded as the time of a reborning, a rebirth, a coming back into life of the promise of immortality. But in any way, we have seen more of this, but we've also seen some other things that are not quite so helpful. We have seen here in the last few years a large number of persons absolutely breaking all laws of common sense, decency, and public physical laws, in rioting, in intoxication, in vandalizing on holy days, where instead of people gathering for some reasonable purpose, they are simply gathering to create a riot. We may yet live to see picketing on Easter Sunday and Christmas. It is just this lost motion, this lost integrity that we all have to face. But actually, there is now a much stronger advent of belief in some of these better things. We find a literature springing up now, more prolific than ever before, I guess, in the history of printing, devoted largely to mysticism, idealism, and the restoration of integrities. This is the way nature, by the law of cause and effect, gradually brings us back to common sense. We are beginning to recognize that what we are doing is intolerable, impossible, and something that we cannot endure ourselves much longer. In the beginning, we break a few rules because it seems like it's fun. But in the end, the rules break us, and that isn't funny. We have more tragedies than we ever thought we would know. So Easter this year is being taken more seriously. But there is still that unfortunate situation in which young people who have been given no training cannot suddenly have respect for these more sacred moments of life. They are not prepared to view anything as sacred. They are not prepared to view life as sacred. And if you look around, you don't know why they have this attitude. That society in general has betrayed them and will continue to do so. But everywhere where a family has a marriage which is sanctified or solemnized by the clergy, that family has a different basis for living than those who are simply willing to go to the justice of the peace or not go anywhere. The family that follows the ritualistic ceremonies of the sacraments, those at least which are known and practiced in the Protestant denominations, these people have accepted a responsibility. They have stated in themselves that the marriage is a spiritual event, that it is an experience in growth, an adventure in maturing the inner life. It is something that we are grateful for. We are grateful for the sincere affections of other people and of the affections of children. And we may be deceived, but where a ceremony is sanctified by religion, the chances of success are much greater. And where there is no ceremony at all, the chances of failure are almost complete. Therefore, it is very necessary for those who have accepted the sacrament of marriage to remember it later. And when things get a little rough in the going, to remember that we have made a convicted statement. We have said what we believe, we did what we thought we wanted to do, and we must pay the consequences. If we began to think of marriage not as something we could get out of, but something that we could grow into until, with an imperfect start, it may improve. The ceremony is very important because it is the first line of defense in the bringing into the world of a new generation of human beings. It is in the home that the miracle of rebirth or regeneration takes place. It is in the home that life comes into manifestation into this world. It is bad enough for this life to come into an environment as unhappy as the one we're in today, but it is even more tragic when the intimate environment into which it is born is plans to have family. Should really remind each other and themselves of the commitment of the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood, that some way these are natural principles. These are not something that were developed by King James in the first edition of the King James Bible. They were not something that the Greeks developed, or the Egyptians, or the Chinese. Every people in the world has recognized the necessity of preparing a sound foundation for the incarnation of children, that they must have the right beginning, and that enough people giving their children the wrong beginning will end in a world war. Once we have destroyed the faith of the young, it is hard to restore it, and it is hard to protect it in them if we have not protected it in ourselves. Therefore, the very great purpose and reason behind all this is to recognize that the coming in of a better generation is the long-range solution to the present problem. They have got to come in and be treated better. They have got to come in and inspired more. They've got to come in with a realization that it is better for themselves and all others that honesty and integrity should dominate their conduct. This training comes from the home. Without the home, there is no such training. Comenius, the founder of the public school system, many years ago, centuries ago, said definitely that the primary educational system is the home, that the first schooling is at the mother's knee, that all of the later intellectualism must be dominated by the inspiring attitude of parents and the love they have for their children and the love which they wish their children to bestow upon their children in due time. Therefore, as Comenius says, any education that they get before they are 10 years old is by far the most important and the most directive. If it is bad up to then, character is badly wounded. If it is good up to that time, the world will not be able to completely defile it afterwards. So idealism, patience, self-sacrifice, the giving up of personal luxuries for the sake of protecting the family spirit, these are musts in our present civilization. And they are also better for the parents of today, because sometime those parents are going to be older and may demand or need a great deal of help from their own children, only to find that these children don't even remember that they existed. All of this type of thing brings the practical reform of things much deeper than trying to reform the tariff regulations or something of that kind. They're all tied together. But the laws of honesty in physical things would not be necessary if the individual himself was innately honest. And where a nation is strongly religious, even though its teachings may be rather elementary, such a family or such a nation has a much greater problem of survival. And we notice now in many of the socialized states that the rise of religion is strongly marked and must be accepted. It can no longer be simply brushed aside. We are beginning to learn politically that without religion no nation can be governed. So these things come back again. If it's true of the nation, it's true of the home. If it is true of all, it is true of each. And the problem of building this into our living is of vital and eternal significance. I might point out that in the Greek world, the development of education was somewhat different from what it is now. They didn't have schools like we have, but were more like the Oriental system. They had teachers, but a teacher was someone who was a scholar, who was learned, usually patient, kindly, maybe a little disciplined, and a little severe to those who were mitigatedly out of line. But the parent took the children to the teacher. Socrates was such a teacher, Diogenes, Plato, Aristotle. They were all teachers, Socrates. All of these teachers had small groups of people that they tutored. The price of tutoring was very small, but not anything like the initiation fees to a modern university. But for a few cents a day, a teacher gave instruction on the subjects with which he was particularly familiar. All these teachers were bound together by the religion of the state. They were all of them true believers in the divine pattern accepted by the communities in which they lived. But they also were able to interpret. Every one of those great teachers of antiquity who taught arithmetic, for example, were not satisfied to simply talk about adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing. Before they got through talking about arithmetic, they talked about practically every cosmic mystery that man has come in contact with. They lifted arithmetic immediately into morality and ethics and divinity, and showed finally the importance of mathematics, because God, in created by geometrizing. So geometry was a sacred science. All these things, trigonometry, higher mathematics, physics, medicine, art, literature, were all sacred sciences. And because they were sacred sciences, the teachers gave part of the moral responsibility. If you studied with a disciple of Pythagoras, you came out of this school convinced of the realities of integrity. You were convinced of the greater world of which we are a part. And each student, before he graduated from his local teacher, was already mindful of what might happen to him in a future embodiment. All this is gone. All is now a great curriculum of rather dusty, musty, and no longer very practical facts. We are not able to get an educational system that in any way will compensate for the family grouping. And the only place now where children can receive the basis of a good life is in their own home. And if they are deprived of this by the utter selfishness of their families, then there is a serious moral responsibility descending upon the parents. And the karmic consequences of this neglect should be borne in mind. Because when we are selfish enough to sacrifice the realities of those nearest to us, simply to our own pleasures and comforts, we are already breaking some of the basic laws of universal procedure. So we know that education is coming into a new way of life. New schools are coming up. New educational systems are being developed. And every day in the newspaper you now see remarks concerning changes in the curricula in order to make it more practical for the person. And now the word practical means moral. It means again the rise of integrities. It has been proved definitely that you cannot have integrity unless you inspire it and reward it. It will not come to simply because it's there. It will become because as a result of it, the individual has the right to make a larger contribution to the common good. All these things are part of the very modern patterns with which we are now concerned. Now, when you take a young couple today and you put them up with the family and all the relatives, friends, and etc., and perform the marriage ceremony for them, you nearly always do feel that there is a sincerity there. The exception, of course, to this is what might be termed the competitive wedding. Now, a competitive wedding is one in which the family has to have a more expensive wedding than the neighbors. And today, a great deal of the expensive weddings is destroying their actual integrity. I noticed in the paper some years ago of a little young woman in New York who committed suicide because her family could not afford to have a name band play at the wedding. Now, this type of thing is not just the result of one family's miserable attitude. It is the result of a way of life in which we are losing sight of value and going into a competition of pretensions, of trying to make things bigger and with no quality consideration of what they're worth. So when you get started on this, I always like to think that in weddings, and this is a policy which I've always used and made a point of, when the time comes for the ceremony, I like to remind the young people that I am performing a ceremony required by the state of California and also required to the ministry of those who have a church or ministerial wedding. I can marry them and unite them by the laws of the state, but I cannot unite them internally in the principles of marriage. I cannot justify or actually perform a wedding in which I unite their hearts and their souls. This they must do for themselves. And the wedding ring becomes a symbol of an eternal bondage, but not to slavery, but a bondage of love for each other. That the highest form of relationship is simple, honest affection. That I can't bestow this in a wedding ceremony. I can't guarantee the result of the ceremony, but I can only perform that which makes possible their growth within themselves toward the goals of a union of spirit and heart for the common good. That these young people start out loving each other first and sacrificing a number of foolish things is a proof of sincerity. And the symbols of union are not valid unless these symbols are vitalized by conduct itself. So we always feel that it's necessary that the wedding ceremony not be considered an adequate beginning of marriage. It is not something that ensures a good marriage, but it may assist in producing one. It is not the answer to all needs. It does not then by legally permit the young people to do exactly as they please, break all the laws of God and nature, and remain responsible because they have a marriage license. This is not the purpose of marriage. The purpose of marriage is a sacrament, and a sacrament is a commitment in the presence of God, a commitment of self to the service of divine principles. It is in this particular case, it is the acceptance by the young people of the commandments of God concerning the conduct of marriage. It guarantees that they will be permitted to have the physical environment necessary for a good home. But the building of the home becomes a spiritual investment based in their own mutual investment of affection and regard. So we have in marriage only a physical thing, unless it is a union of souls. Now, in our day, unions of souls are a little difficult. First of all, many people don't even know they have a soul. And many of them manage to get through life without proving that they have one. But for the most part, the soul is there. And love is the easiest way of bringing this to the surface. But it has to be sincere. I think that the idea of the older generation of betrothal was very legitimate. I don't think an individual should meet someone on Tuesday and get the license on Friday. There should be time for thought, time for mediation and for consideration. There should be an opportunity to understand and know better exactly what is involved in a commitment. Also, there is a great deal of worry on matters of ulterior motive, but this can very often be discovered with a little timely thought. In the old days, there were very often what were called the marriage brokers. They were the ones that helped to select appropriate mates for various persons contemplating matrimony. The Chinese were very particular in having the ancestral pattern do the marriage brokerage work. And they had certain advantages in it that we have lost. It seems as though it's some way in this thing that before we have a final marriage, there should be some form of counseling. There should be some way of determining more of the compatibility of these people, that they should understand their own backgrounds and what they have to give and what they will demand. The inexperienced, emotion-dominated person with no understanding of the responsibilities of life is in a poor position to make a good marriage, and yet that is where most of them begin. Now, there are some who, regardless of anything you can do, you cannot destroy that marriage. It is indestructible. There are a great many people who find in this sacrament a fulfillment of the highest hopes and aspirations of life. I remember not too long ago I attended a party to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of a couple that had been married for 60 years. And the two looking side by side looked like two beautiful figures from some classic work. They were young, they did not resemble each other very much, but at their age then, they were both in their 90s. The two looked almost exactly alike. They had grown together in every sense of the word, and while they were sitting like two bashful beaux in their teens, receiving the congratulation of 3 generations, I noticed that he put out his hand and squeezed hers without looking, but appearing very indifferent. But he was just bashful, that was all. But this type of thing happens. And where it happens, something very wonderful does happen. This is the type of marriage they can say was made in heaven. It is the type of thing that we all would long for and want to have. But more could come nearer to it if they would try. Because I have a great many people come to explain to me why they can't make it, and wanting my opinion and all counseling as to what they can do to help to repair the situation. Most of the time the causes of trouble are very superficial. They simply represent a lack of unselfishness for even a moment. They require no sentiment or appeal for the sensitivity of each other. I know that such cases can be very hard to work with, but nature sometimes steps in and gives very curious remedies to some of these things. A lady came to me many years ago who had an obstreperous husband. And of course there are such things. And this man would not allow his wife to learn to drive a car. She was married to him for over 40 years and never permitted to drive a car. Well, we did our best. I even saw him about a little bit about it also, but it looked as though it was hopeless. He belonged to some somewhat foreign background that was very stilted in these matters. But all of a sudden, without anybody having to do anything about it, heaven stepped in. The husband had a stroke. He wasn't badly incapacitated, but he could never get a driver's license again. So he had to let his wife learn to drive the car. Well, fate produces these very strange and unusual things sometimes, and they are obviously part of a large natural pattern. Nature has so endowed the individual that he has many aspects of his own nature. There are very few people who are not more or less compound in their potentials. They have a great many submerged assets and abilities and values that they don't ever release into manifestation. Under proper affectional relationships, these may be strengthened and more or less released. We will find that with affection, we can do things we never thought we could. And we can enjoy things we never thought or believed we would enjoy, simply because we were making happiness for someone we care for. And little by little, without too much interference, many of the complaints of young married couples can be arbitrated. But the world is very hard on these people. and it doesn't seem to be willing to make any considerations for them. The reason undoubtedly is simple. The legislators came mostly from unhappy homes themselves. They were part of a pattern of misunderstanding, misdirection, which they had accepted along with all who followed them. The world was following the wrong road. It was following a pathway that never had succeeded and never will. Now, up to a few years ago, there were some people at least who realized that the breaks that we are making never have succeeded. But in order to do that, you have to be literate. You have to be able to read a little history. You also have to get away from the television long enough to realize that that is not the custodian of integrities. But it is true that if a person studied a little the history of civilization, they would very soon come to understand the broad foundations of human relationship. They would know why nations rise and why they fall. They would know why rulers become tyrants or do not become tyrants. They know why religions pass through renovations and changes over periods of time. And they also realize the perpetual adjustment of the inner life to progress in the physical world. We are all adjusting constantly to the changes in our environment. And these changes are very desperate unless we have some solid core within ourselves. If we are living on the outside of ourselves, we do not have much luck trying to adjust to the outsides of the world. There has to be a solid core in every person, a core of basic conviction, a basic purpose, of dreams, of ideals, of reasons for existence. There must be some form of higher life within us, or we cannot cope with the problems of material existence. It doesn't mean we have to be great scholars or great thinkers. It only means that we have to have a certain kindliness toward values, toward realities. We have to maintain affections that sometimes we keep for a few years and then they fade away. We have to make them last for a lifetime if we want to cure this particular problem. So in order to get past the Chinese code, and that also which we find in early Christendom, we have to realize that the individual is really a spiritual being. This you have to get some way into your consciousness, that the individual is a spiritual being. The proof of this is rather obvious, however. You don't have to do anything very extraordinary to prove it. The mere fact that you are here proves it. You wouldn't be here at all unless you were alive, and the only life in you is a divine life in you. That mysterious power which science has never been able to discover, that mysterious substance that makes us live, is something that is far deeper than daily existence. It is something that makes possible all of the experiences of living. It is the power of the thinker. It is the simple basis of affection. It is also health, and it is art and music and everything that is important in life. All arises from some deep source within ourselves. And this source is our divinity. And this divinity is the spark of God in ourselves. When we pervert life, we pervert the power of life. Every perversion that we make is directly a resentment of God, an unwillingness to accept the divine, a denial of the spiritual values of existence. As long as we keep on denying, we will cut off the strength of this internal resource, this resource that is there, and while it can be damaged and it can be so concealed that maybe for several embodiments it may not be able to function, but it is there ultimately and it will win. The individual, in spite of anything that he can do, think, or say, will ultimately outgrow his own weaknesses. But it's the hard way. Then we have to be punished constantly for our mistakes. To be punished for a mistake is not too bad, but to be punished constantly for the same mistakes and remedy them in no obvious way is simply lack of common sense. And life has a lot of common sense in it, but it's not in the curriculum at the present time. It's still waiting for inclusion. So the life within us demands something. The inner life demands more than we give. While the outer life is constantly compromising for pleasure or profit, the inner life is constantly asking for integrity. It is asking that the individual fulfill the inner values of his own character, that he becomes actually a person of worth, a person who is keeping the rules. Now, as we go through along the way of life, these rules become more and more difficult sometimes, but we must still try to keep them, because it is the way we live now that is going to determine not only the way we live somewhere later, but how the world is going to live with the children that we have brought into it. We have a duty to ourselves to grow, and we have a duty to help those who come after us to benefit from our growth, to understand what we can contribute to their unfoldment and their maturity. Again, I think there's so much to be said for Comenius, who was a very wonderful idealist, a Moravian clergyman, a contemporary of Bacon and Hartlib and many of the interesting personalities of the 17th century. Comenius had a little book that he prepared for young students, and these students were taught the ABCs of life. And he had a book in which all these ABCs were represented by little moral images. And he was trying to teach all these young people to realize that their home was their security, that their parents were the visible expressions of the divine being, that their mothers and fathers were their greatest and truest friends and always would be, that these friends, because they loved them, would do everything possible to have the child grow up an upright, worthy citizen, capable of carrying his part of the world's load of responsibility. He also pointed out, even back in there, that there was no saying what was going to happen to these young people. They come into the world, they go to school, and they get an education, and they go out and do all kinds of things. But somewhere among these young people who have had their first education at their mother's knee must come the great executives, the leaders of policy, the lawyers, the physicians, all of those who are called more or less the leaders of culture, all the scientists, biologists and physicists and astronomers. Somewhere back in there were little ones at the mother's knee. Now, a great deal depended on what the mother did. And for the most part, I think in those days she did a generally better job than is being done now. There are some very devout ones now, let's not mistake that for a moment. But there are too many to whom employment and progress in business comes first. Little by little, this wisdom of the mother is fading out in the new generation, and will not be available when these younger people, coming to maturity, take over the burden of running the world. They have not had the touch of grace. Many of them have not any strong religious beliefs, but they would have had something if in the parental life they had seen the sacrifice, charity, humility, dedication, devotion, and sincerity. These things coming to the child from the person closest to that child, and coming over a period of life in which the most sensitive parts of living are being molded. These basic teachers from the mother's knee are going to, and did, affect the history of the world. They were the great sources of strength. We are losing these sources of strength because of industrial or economic considerations. But somehow, something must be done to teach the child before it goes to school, to teach it in the home or in the family. And in the average family, if there was real cooperation, there could be a fairly solid little classroom for those who need particular training. If the parents are busy, there are the uncles and the aunts and the grandparents and the cousins and the nephews. There are many, and someone among them can help to bring up the children. And if privation or desolation comes, things can be done to make sure that these young people growing up are not going to be the dictators and agitators and destroyers of tomorrow. The aggressive, combative person is a product of something. And if we can remove what causes him, he will be, along with all others, a more useful and helpful and intelligent citizen. So we should all try, in any way we can, to support these things and find in the fulfillment of a better life that which is far more joyous than a fun generation supported by narcotics. We do not need fun. We need to enjoy the glories of a good life. We need to enjoy the privilege of seeing those who come after growing up among us. We have a right to see institutions created for human benefit, staffed by persons who believe in human benefit. We have a right to see that the world's work is done by people who have conscience, who have ideals, who have hopes, who have dreams like our own. And if this happens, we probably won't need very much armament, because armament is really prepared and maintained largely for those combative personalities who have been wounded in some way by the materialism of our present systems. So we have to try and find new ways to do these things. But each one in his own little life, in his own little way, can be a little more kind, a little more generous, a little more thoughtful, and in that way make a very important time. And on such holidays as Christmas and Easter, there should be a serious thoughtfulness as to our moral duty to each other and our spiritual duty to the deity from which we are descended. If we keep these thoughts carefully in mind, I think we will have a more valuable and permanently happy relationship with life. Thank you.